attempting to maybe get get a job at the site. The INL, sometimes I tell people the site, and if you're not local, you're like, what's he talking about? But, yeah, so he's looking at that. So he had the interview Thursday, and so pray that God's will be done in that area. And so other ones I have, Donna Walters is here, but Gary Walters is ill, so I want to be praying for him. And Gary Akesian's here, but Patty Akesian is ill, and so I want to be praying for her. And I'm sure there might be some other people with some other needs, but God knows those prayers. Amen? So let us go to the Lord in prayer at this time.
We are continuing in a series on the book of Genesis, calling it our origin story. This is where we're going back to the very beginning of the Bible and looking at our origin story, how everything came to be, including you and me. Really, it's the beginning of God's story, isn't it? Genesis is the beginning of God's story, and that's what we've been learning for this whole year, the past several weeks. Last week, we looked at Genesis chapter 19, which is a story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a Grady story, wasn't it? We saw the judgment of God. It's something that's important to discuss now and then. One of the things I think about is thinking about like this. Jesus Christ has two comings, right? Two comings. His first coming, he came to save the world. His second coming, he's going to come to judge the world. And Sodom and Gomorrah stands as a stark reminder to us that even though the days have stacked up since Jesus was here, he will come again and he will judge the earth. And those of us who have believed in Jesus Christ, we have been justified through his atoning work on the cross, his substitutionary atonement on the cross. We are found not guilty. And so we won't face God's judgment in that way, will we? And that's a beautiful thing. Just like how God rescued Lot and his two daughters from Sodom and Gomorrah, he rescues us from the incoming judgment. But we need to be aware that it is coming. God has to make everything right. That's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, today, we're going to continue looking at two stories. Both of them are also gritty. You know, one of the reasons why I love the Bible is because it keeps it real. You know, the patriarchs of the faith and the matriarchs, the men and women of God, all littered out throughout the book of Genesis and throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament. People like Abraham, people like Lot, people like Paul, people like David, people like Peter, people like Ruth, people like Mary Magdalene. These people are real people. They're not make-believe. And so what does that mean? Oh, they sin. And sometimes we might think, okay, yeah, they're not perfect. We know that. And there's nobody who's perfect except for Jesus. So they're not perfect. We understand that. But they only sinned in, small ways, right? They didn't sin in big ways. They sinned in, like goody two-shoe ways. Not like criminal ways, right? No. These people sin big time. Some of their sins make us blush. And so we can look at them, and what do? We can see ourselves. Because we also sin big time. We have to admit that, right? We don't just sin small sins, we sin big sins as well, even as believers. That's the gnarly thing. Oh, wouldn't it be great if we could have a story that looked like this? I was a sinner. I did some gnarly stuff. I sinned, I lived like the world. Then God saved me, and I've been fairly clean ever since. How many of you can raise your hand and say that's your story, right? You've been pretty clean ever since Jesus saved you. Yeah. And the same thing is true of the people of the Bible. And that's why the Bible can be so powerful to us, so impactful to us. Not only is it God's inerrant word that guides us and directs us, but the people of the Bible are real. They're relatable. And so what we're going to learn today is, the topic for today is this: God uses imperfect people. Now, some of you might be thinking, of course, because otherwise God really couldn't use anybody, because there's no perfect people. Maybe we could talk about his son, Jesus. His son, when he came to earth, was fully God, but then he added on humanity, so now he's fully human, and he was perfect, right? He never sinned. He never broke God's law. He was perfect in every way, shape, and form. So God could use Jesus, but he can't use the rest of us schmucks. No. God uses imperfect people. And by that I mean not simply that none of us are perfect, right? I also mean this, and this is what's so important. We're going to see this in God's word today in Genesis chapter 20. God doesn't just use us because we're not, he doesn't just use imperfect people because none of us are perfect. What I also mean is this: God uses us when we're actively not being perfect. When we're actively sinning, God can still use us. This is the hope for us today. This is the encouragement for you today. That even when you fall down and stumble, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you are a follower of God, He has saved you. He can still use you to be a light, even in the midst of your sin, even in the midst of your bad decisions. And now, if that doesn't quite make sense, just hold on, because it will as we go through these stories. So, we're going to look at the end of Genesis 19 and Genesis chapter 20. And we're going to look at two people that God used, okay? Two people that God used who lived messy, sinful lives, all right? And it will be an encouragement for us when we think about our lives, like, am I good enough to be used by God? Am I smart enough to be used by God? Am I clean enough to be used by God? And we will find that if you follow Christ, He will use you. It's not about being good enough. He has called you, and He will use you. So let's begin with looking at Lot. And this is found in Genesis 19, verses 30 to 38. Both of these stories we're going to look at are messy. They're hard to read. There's big sins involved, if you will. Big sins, okay? But we'll see that God is in the midst of both stories. And there's a reason why, at first you might be like, why is this in the Bible? You ever read the Bible and you're like, why did God include this story? Of all the things that happen in history, why is this in there? Well, God doesn't make a mistake. Everything in the Bible is precisely in there for us, as 2 Timothy 3:16 says, to profit us, to equip us, to train us for our good. And that includes these two messy stories. So let's begin with Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 to 38. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him, and again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. So the first person we're going to see God used who's being actively imperfect is Lot. Lot. Now, we learned this last week in Genesis chapter 9, that Lot fled Sodom and this other city, Gomorrah. He lived in Sodom, though, because God was going to destroy it because it was exceedingly wicked, exceedingly sinful. The two angels, they looked as like men, but they were angels, came and rescued Lot and his family. And he said to them, remember, before God rained down fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed the city, he said, "Run to the mountains. Don't look back." Now, do you remember what Lot said? "I can't go to the mountains. I might not make it. There's this little town over here. Can I just go there?" And the angels are like, "Okay, you can go there." And so they run, they flee. They're going to this little town. It's called Zoar, which means little or insignificant. Unfortunately, Lot's wife looked back because I guess her heart was still there in Sodom. Is the imagery, the picture. We definitely see that in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus says, don't be like Lot's wife who looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. But Lot and his two daughters made it to Zoar. And when we pick up the story at the end of Genesis 19, we see that Lot didn't stay in Zoar. Why? Because he was afraid. Now, why was Lot afraid of this little town, Zoar? The Bible doesn't say. But I'm thinking it's perhaps because Lot is just afraid now, right? He's just afraid. He's a scaredy cat because he just saw his hometown burn up. It was an evil, sinful place. God judged it. It just went, everybody went up in smoke. He just saw his wife, just looking back, turn into a pillar of smoke. So just living with other people, he might have been fearful that God would come and judge it again, something like that maybe. And so what he does is he ends up going to the mountains. Or perhaps he went to the mountains because he just realized in Zoar, the angels are right. I should just be in the mountains anyways. This is the safe place for me. But he leaves. He's afraid of Zoar. He goes to the mountains, and he and his two daughters live in a cave, evidently by themselves. Now, you remember Lot wasn't so pristine in Genesis 19 when God judged Sodom and Gomorrah, was he? He started off very well. The angels came. He was hospitable toward them. He invited them over to his house. Then all the townsmen came out and said, "Bring out these two men to us. We want to sleep with them." And Lot bravely went out of the door, came out of his door, and said, "Men, don't do this wicked thing. These are my guests. Don't do this wicked thing." If Lot just shut his mouth right there, I think he might have been okay. And then this story that we're about to cover right now would never have happened, potentially. I don't think it would have ever happened. But no, in order to appease this unruly mob, and you can't really appease an unruly mob, nothing appeases them. They have to be satiated with their own wickedness. Or they have to be punished. They have to be dispersed. But in order to appease them, he said, "Here, I have two daughters. They are virgins. They've never known a man. I'll give them to you. You can do whatever you want with them." What kind of a father is that? Dads, could you ever do that to your daughters? Of course, what we found out is he had already arranged for his daughters to be married to two men from Sodom who were there at that door because it said every man was there. So they were demanding this inappropriate form of sex, weren't they? So they weren't really good chums either. So Lot didn't even arrange good men for his daughters to marry, and now he's having them potentially handing over to the town of Sodom to have their way with them. I mean, it's just horrific. It's hard to even fathom the depth. And this guy's a man of God, supposedly. The depth of depravity that he had. Well, this comes back to bite him. There's consequences for the decisions that we make. There's a consequence for Lot choosing to go to Sodom in the first place. Do you remember this? When he and Abraham, his uncle, back then it was Abram, they had so many possessions in the land that God called Abram to that their household started to fight. And Abram says, let's not fight. You can choose where to live. We'll separate, right? Well, what did Lot choose? He chose the land that would make him the most prosperous. He could have stayed near his uncle, just lived a little bit further away, still within that promised area. No, he chose to live in a land that would make him the most prosperous. It was a worldly decision. It was a fleshly decision. And he paid for it dearly, didn't he? One, because Sodom was defeated by the four kings, and Abraham had to go rescue him. And then, even though he probably accumulated wealth there, even though he became a judge or somebody involved in government or leadership there because he sat at the city gate, and he became a man of repute there, what did it lead to? Him arranging wicked men to marry his two daughters. His wife becoming enamored with Sodom, so much so that when she left, she couldn't leave it behind. She had to look back, and it cost her life. That he was compromised. He hesitated leaving Sodom, didn't he? The angels had to grab him by a hand and force him out on behalf of Abraham. And then now what's going to happen is he's hiding away in fear in a cave far from this prosperous land that he chose, and his two daughters are going to have an incestuous relationship with him. His whole family has been destroyed because of that one decision. That's why you and I have to be so careful with the decisions that we make. Are we making worldly decisions with my life? Are we making a worldly decision with our life? Are we making a worldly decision with my family's life? Do I care more about having wealth and prestige in this world, or do I care more about following God and His will for my life? Being a good father, being a good mother, being a good daughter, being a good son, being a good spouse. Lot chose the wrong path, and he paid for it dearly. And we see it all coming to a conclusion here in this story. He gave his daughters up to an unruly mob. Well, his daughters are, that's going to turn around back on him, isn't it? There's consequences for that. And so now his daughters are going to get him to drink wine and then take turns having a sensuous relationship with him so they can become pregnant and further the line, the progeny of their father's line. And again, this is born out of fear. Fear is prominent in this story. Lot went away from people, had to live up in a cave all by himself because he was afraid. His two daughters had an incestuous affair with their father because they were afraid, right? That, we're not going to have anybody to marry. And this is what fear does. I've learned this from the Bible. This is what fear does. Number one, it takes our eyes off of God, and it puts it on the thing that's making us afraid. Okay? It takes our eyes off of God, and it puts it on the thing that we're afraid of, so that now we're focusing on that. We're no longer focusing on an awesome, powerful, all-supreme God who cares for us, will protect us, will guide us, will provide for us, will see us through it. No, we're looking at this thing that we're afraid of, and it's growing in size because of our focus on it again and again and again, right? Lost daughters are like, we're never going to be married. We're never going to be able to be a wife because we're up here, there's no men. We're never going to be able to have babies. We have to do something. We have to take matters into our own hands in this drastic way. And the second thing that fear does is this. It takes our eyes off the big picture. It takes our eyes off the big picture, and it puts it on how do we just get over our fear, right? Because if Lot's two daughters weren't afraid, and they were trusting God, because God, remember, just took them out of Sodom. He protected them. They could have been pillars of salt. They could have been destroyed by the salt from the fire, but God protected them. They are alive because of the Lord, but now they've stopped trusting God, and they turned to fear, and so now they don't have the big picture, which is what? That they can go to another town. Maybe they stay here with their father. Maybe they eventually can convince their father to go to another town. Maybe their father eventually passed away, but they can still go to another town and marry. They were short-sighted because of their fear. They were short-sighted in their thinking. That's what fear does. And so they did this drastic thing. It reminds me of when Sarah, Abraham's wife, had fear that she wasn't going to be able to give her husband a child. And so what did she do? She took matters into her own hands. She lost the big picture that God is faithful and was going to provide them with a child. She took matters into her own hand. She said, Abraham, I want you to sleep with my maidservant Hagar. And Abraham put up a huge stink. He's like, I cannot do this. This is terrible. I can't do this thing. No. He's like, all right. Because he's thinking fleshly. And so he did. And it ruined that household for a while, didn't it? Because the dynamic between Sarah and her maidservant was destroyed. The relationship between Sarah and Abraham there was tension. There was tension in the household. And there's forever tension because now Abraham has this child that's not Sarah. It just created all these problems because Sarah was afraid. And she didn't trust God. It's a great reminder for us that fear takes our eyes off of God and it makes us short-sighted potentially so that we do sinful things instead of trusting God in the long term, that he's going to come through for us like he always does. So the two daughters' wicked plot works. Perhaps if Lot would have set up his daughters with holy men, godly men, they would have gone with them, right? Do you remember the two fiancés where thought Lot was joking when he said that God is going to judge Sodom and destroy the place? They're like, that's okay, that's a good joke. I think I'm going to go back to what I was doing. And so they were destroyed. But if Lot would have arranged for his two daughters to marry righteous men, they would have been there with him, right? And then Lot's two daughters, those two men would have married, they would have had children, and there would be a nice descendant line for Lot. But no. Instead, they had this affair with their father, and it produced two sons. The older daughter had a son named Moab, and Moab means from father, and that is the Moabites, the Bible says, of today. That would be Moses' time because Moses penned Genesis. So it would have been during Moses' time. Remember, Moses most likely wrote this while they're wandering the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, okay, as a way to encourage them that God has given them the promised land. That's their land he promised to their forefather Abraham, and then consequently to them. And so he's saying Lot's older daughter gave birth to his son named Moab, and they produced the Moabites of today. Lot's younger daughter also had a son named Ben-Ami, which means son of my father's people, and he produces the Ammonites of Moses' day. Here's what's important about this. One of the reasons why this is in the Bible. The Moabites and the Ammonites would become Israel's enemies. Remember, Israel is Abraham's descendants, right? Abraham is the first Hebrew. God chose him to create a people through him, the Israelite people. And of course, through the Israelite people would come Jesus Christ, and through Jesus Christ, all the nations are blessed, right? And we see that in the church because the church is made up of every single nation. Okay, that's how that passage is fulfilled. It's the Abrahamic covenant that through Abraham's descendants, all the nations would be blessed. So through the Jewish people, all nations are blessed because of Jesus the Messiah, because he died on the cross for everybody's sins. And we find that salvation through Christ, and we enter into his body, which is the church. But the Moabites and Ammonites would be Israel's enemies. They would be a thorn in Israel's side. The Moabites would seduce Israel into sexual morality. We see this in Numbers chapter 25. It says Israelite men indulged in sexual immorality with Moabite women, and these Moabite women then invited them to make sacrifices to their gods. Then we also see that the Ammonites tempted the Israelites with child sacrifice. Leviticus 18:21. We see for the Israelites not to follow that practice of sacrificing children to the god Molech. The god Molech was one of the Ammonite gods. Eventually, God would do to the Moabites and the Ammonites what he did to Sodom and Gomorrah. Zephaniah 2:9 says, "Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, surely Moab will become like Sodom, the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place of weeds and salt pits, a wasteland forever. The remnant of my people will plunder them. The survivors of my nation will inherit their land." Because of Lot's decision to go to Sodom, which is a wicked place, have his 2 daughters be eventually married to 2 wicked men, having to flee from this city because God was going to destroy it because of its exceeding wickedness, going up into a cave out of fear, not trusting God, living in a cave, just him and his daughters, that his daughters produced children by him, and those 2 children would be the wicked Moabites, the wicked Ammonites, who God would eventually destroy, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a terribly sad and tragic story. You might think to yourself, was Lot even saved? These are big sins. These are horrible sins. I want to read you something, though, in the Apostle Peter's second epistle, second letter. It's very interesting. It paints a picture that we don't necessarily see. I want to read this to you. It's 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. If God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example of what is coming for the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the perverted conduct of unscrupulous people, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from a trial, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge the flesh in his corrupt passion and despise authority. So even though Lot failed terribly in so many ways, God calls him righteous. How can that be? Because Lot believed God. God had justified him. And even though he did wicked things, God still considered him a righteous man and was making him more and more righteous. So he belonged to God. He was a man of God. But he sinned greatly, didn't he? He was flawed and messy. We see this time and time again with people in the Bible, right? David committed adultery and murder. And those are just some of his sins. There's others. But God used Lot, as flawed and messy as he was, to remain righteous in Sodom. And he used him as an example of how God rescues the righteous, the godly, from a trial. And that way we can look at Lot and say, God rescued him from a sinful land, a sinful people, a sinful nation. And God will do the same for you and me when he comes again. He will rescue us from his judgment when he brings it upon the rest of the land. Now we're going to look at a second story. And this second story is of Abraham, how God used Abraham even though Abraham was imperfect. And this is found in Genesis chapter 20. Let me read that for us. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister,' and didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I've kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die." Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, "I said to myself, 'There is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife.' And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah to his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'My land is before you. Live wherever you like.' To Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves, so they could have children again. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. Here's something important we need to know about this story. This is deja vu. This is, isn't it? It's deja vu. It's like what Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. Because back in Genesis 12, Abraham pulled this same stunt, and it didn't work out then either. And here he is again, some 20 plus years later, pulling that stunt again. And here's what the stunt is. Abraham, and fear is also all throughout this second story, was afraid. That's how this starts. That's how this terrible story starts. Abraham was afraid. He was afraid because his wife Sarah is so beautiful. What a problem to have, right, men? His wife Sarah is so beautiful that he's like, if I go into these foreign lands, God is calling me out of my home country and into this land he's promised me. If I go through these foreign lands as I get there, they might kill me for my wife, is what he's thinking. I'm afraid. So Sarah, just tell everybody you're my sister, and then I'll be saved. I won't die. And he rationalizes it in his mind because he's like, she is technically my sister, my half-sister, right? She is her father's daughter, but not her mother's daughter. So she's my half-sister, so I'm not technically lying, even though she's my wife. Well, in Genesis 12, Abraham, back then he was Abram, right? Traveled through Egypt, and when he went to Egypt, all the Egyptians were like, wow, Sarah is beautiful. And the Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, took her into his harem, we could say, right? And while he's in the harem, God inflicts serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household. Pharaoh recognizes this is because Sarah doesn't belong to him, and so he says to Abraham, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me Sarah was your wife?" And then he sent Abraham on his way. Get out of my country. And everything that they had accumulated in Egypt, because they had accumulated great wealth at that time. And then Abraham, again, some 20 plus years later, decides to move from where he's at in Hebron, in Mamre in Hebron, to, first it's Kadesh, and then eventually he goes into Gerar. Now, why did Abraham move? The Bible doesn't say. Perhaps it's because we just saw him at the end of Genesis, or near the end of Genesis 19, looking out from his tent and seeing the smoke of Sodom, and he's like, I don't want to stay here. It also could be because he's semi-nomadic, right? He's a herdsman. He's got a lot of cattle, sheep, goats, things like this, and so maybe they ate up the land and he had to move to a new land. It could be either one of those things, maybe both. But he ends up going to Gerar, and he tells his wife Sarah the same thing. Say that I'm your sister because I don't want to be killed over you because of how beautiful you are. Now, if any of you have been tracking with Genesis these past several weeks, you might be scratching your head because you're like, well, at this point, Sarah's 90 years old. 90 years old. She's still beautiful. Because when they get in the land, sure enough, the king of Gerar takes her into his harem, right? Now, it could be because she was very beautiful. It could also be because, and this was a common practice back in this ancient time, he wanted to marry her to create some kind of a treaty with Abraham. Abraham was very wealthy, very well known. Remember, he alone defeated those 4 kings that attacked and took over Sodom and other nations. And so Abraham went after them to rescue Lot and his possessions. So Abraham is a strong person in his land. So it's possible that Abimelech wanted to create a treaty with him by marrying his sister. That was common practice back then. Also of note is that Abimelech most likely is a title for the king, not the king's actual name. It would be like Pharaoh in Egypt. So Abimelech, because we'll see Abimelech again later, because not only does Abraham commit this same sin twice of saying, my wife is my sister, eventually his son Isaac is going to do the same thing to another king named Abimelech. But we'll get to that in the ensuing weeks. So Gerar takes Abraham's wife Sarah into his harem. And then God speaks to Abimelech of Gerar takes Abraham's wife Sarah into his harem. And then one night, God speaks to Abimelech in a dream. And he says this, "You are a dead man." Would you like to have that dream tonight? You are a dead man. The woman, because you have a woman in your harem who does not belong to you. She is married. But Abimelech had not done anything with Sarah yet, okay? So he was innocent in that way. He didn't have an affair with her. And so he pleads with the Lord, "Are you going to destroy an innocent man and an innocent nation? I didn't do anything with her." And didn't Abraham anyways tell me that she was his sister, not his wife? I have clean hands in all of this. And God says, "Yes, you do have clean hands, but I've also kept you from sinning against me." From sinning against me by being with Sarah. And I think that's pretty incredible. In other words, Abimelech would have an affair with Sarah, unbeknownst to him. But God, in his sovereignty, kept Abimelech from doing that. Isn't that incredible? Why? Because Sarah had to be with Abraham in order to produce the son Isaac. Think about what a disaster Abraham's sin could have led to. Think about what a disaster. He goes to Gerar, right? Remember, the three visitors just visited Abraham in Mamre and said, "We're going to come back, and in 1 year time, you're going to have a son." 1 year time, okay? Sarah laughed, but that's exactly what God said. So then he picks up, he moves to Gerar. Sarah's not my wife, she's my sister. The king takes her into his harem to marry her. That means Abraham cannot have a baby with Sarah. She's going to have a baby potentially with the king of Abimelech, or she'll just stay barren. But either way, that line, that descendant, the covenant of God that God made with Abraham to turn him into a great nation would have been stopped. But what do we learn about God? No plan of his can be thwarted. So he caused Abimelech not to be with Sarah. Abimelech was like, "God, I've acted righteously." Well, God made you. God made it that way. Let's make sure we recognize that it's God and it's God's doing. But God says, okay, you do have clean hands. He recognizes that, mostly because of God's doing. And he tells Abimelech in this dream to return her to Abraham because Abraham is a prophet. And this is the very first time in the Bible the word prophet is used. Okay, a prophet is someone who is a spokesperson for God. It's also, a prophet in the Bible also describes a relationship, someone who has a relationship with God, a close relationship with God. And so this is Abraham. He's chosen by God to speak for God. And he would do that to the people of Gerar in just a little bit. If Abimelech returns Sarah to her husband, Abraham, then Abraham is going to pray for Abimelech and he will live. If he doesn't, God is going to strike him dead and the whole nation. So God is not messing around, right? God is not messing around. Nobody is going to mess with the Abrahamic covenant. God will have Abraham and Sarah have a child. That child will be Isaac. Isaac will have another child, and that child will have another child, and it will produce, all these descendants will produce the Jewish people. Through the Jewish people, God will have the Messiah be born, and through the Messiah, God will save the entire world. Or at least make the entire world savable, right? But he will offer salvation to the entire world. Nothing is going to mess with this plan because this is the whole point of God's history. The whole reason why he made the earth. He knew that it was going to fall. This is the whole point. This is the entire story of the Bible. In a nutshell, it begins with his covenant with Abraham, right? And through him would become the Messiah, and through the Messiah would come salvation to everyone who believes. And then one day that Messiah would come back, and he's going to make everything right, and all unbelievers will be judged, cast into the eternal lake of fire. All believers will go up to the new heaven, new earth, and spend eternity there with God forever. It all begins with the Abrahamic covenant, and it's at a threat right now because of Abraham's foolishness. Even though Abraham is supposed to be this pillar of faith, this great man of God. What did the Bible say? Abraham believed, and God credited to him as righteousness. And here he is afraid, and he's putting the whole plan in jeopardy of the Messiah. But God is sovereign, And he's going to use Abraham even though Abraham is faithless in this moment. Because nothing is going to thwart God's plan to save his earth. To save his people. And then eventually to save the earth. Abimelech eventually, after this dream, calls his wise men, as you can imagine, officials. He tells them what's happening, and they're all afraid. Whoa, this is serious. You better do what God says. And then Abimelech calls in Abraham and says, why did you do this to me? Why? Why would you do such a thing? This is not a good thing. This is unheard of. And what does Abraham say? I didn't think you feared God. AKA, I thought you were a rascal, and you might kill me. So I was afraid. I said she was my sister. And besides, she really is technically my sister, right? Well, even though this doesn't seem like a confession to me of sin on Abraham's part, but Abimelech seems to welcome this. But still, I think Abraham should have confessed. 1 John 1, 8 through 10 explains this well. It says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Abraham, I think, was trying to get around his sin. And so maybe in that moment, the truth was not in him. 1 John goes on to say, if we confess our sins, though, God is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. If we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar, and his word is not in us. And so it's important for us, when we sin, to own up to it. God knows we did it. We know we did it. We're not hiding it from him. We're not tricking him. We're not deceiving him. He sees everything. That's what the book of Hebrews says. He sees everything. All of creation is unhidden in his sight. Everything we do, every wicked thing we've ever done, every wicked thought we've ever thought, every wicked word we ever heard, we've ever said, God knows, sees, and heard. And so we can't deceive him. The best thing that we can do, the very best thing that we can do when we sin is to say, God, I sinned against you. I'm sorry. And God is faithful every single time to forgive us. Restore us. Abimelech, it's fascinating because here you have Abimelech as an unbeliever. You have Abraham is a believer. And yet Abimelech seems to be a better man in this story than Abraham. And that can be the case. This is life. Life is messy. Sometimes you can have an unbeliever who lives, maybe at least at a time, in a more honorable fashion than a believer, because a believer can get into real sin, real sinful ways. Abimelech returns Sarah to Abraham, and not only that, he gives Abraham things. He gives him cattle, servants, male and female servants. He says, my land is before you, live wherever you like. Right? Pharaoh in Genesis 12, when Abraham first did this, Pharaoh kicked him out of the land. But Abimelech says, no, you can live here, whatever you like. And then if that wasn't enough, this is how great of a guy Abimelech was. He gave Abraham 1,000 shekels. That's 25 pounds of silver. 25 pounds of silver to cover the offense that Sarah experienced in all of this. So that way, everybody who looked at her would know, okay, she's been vindicated. She's been vindicated by the king. As a result of this, Abraham prayed, and God healed Abimelech. So first of all, Abimelech wouldn't be punished, and then God healed Abimelech and healed Abimelech's wife and healed all the female servants in his household because evidently God had struck them so that they could not conceive. Again, he did not want Sarah giving birth to somebody other's son. She was to give birth to Isaac, okay, in 1 year's time. If she gave birth to Abimelech's king, Isaac wouldn't have been born in 1 year, and God's promise wouldn't have come true. So God put an end to that. No one is giving birth in this household, okay? And God heals them, and now they're able to conceive again. Here is what we learn in this story. Why is this story in the Bible? I believe it's this. One, it's so that we can see that God went to great lengths to preserve the Abrahamic covenant, to be intact. But I think it also shows us this. When we are faithless, as followers of God, God is still faithful. It is precisely when we don't deserve grace that God is so gracious with us. It is precisely when we don't deserve help because of our own foolishness that God so wonderfully helps us anyways. It is precisely when we don't deserve forgiveness because we commit the same sin again and again and again and again and again that God chooses to forgive us again and again and again and again and again, every single time. Whenever we are faithless, God is faithful. 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot disown himself. Whenever we sin, God's grace increases. Whenever we try to mess up God's plan and purpose for our life, God intervenes and protects us from ourselves. Whenever we aren't a very good Christian, if I can put it like that, God still can shine through us in the lives of others. Think about this. Abimelech, who is a non-believer, was able to act significantly better than Abraham, but God still used Abraham to bless Abimelech and the nation of Gerar. Now, the point here that I'm making is not that we can just go on sinning and God is going to use us. Everything is great. I can sin. I can't thwart God's plan for God's wonderful plan for my life. I can just keep on sinning. No, that's not true. What did Paul say in Romans chapter 6 when he talked about how the more we sin, the more grace increases? He says, does that mean we should sin even more so grace increases even more? By no means no. The point of God's grace is not for us to be able to get away with sin. The point of God's grace is to cover our sin. And if we have big sins, God's grace is even bigger, and it still covers it. That's the whole point. And the other thing I think that's important to understand here when I say God uses imperfect people and God can still use us even though we're in sin is if we are believers of God, believers in Jesus Christ, and we're following him. If we're in open rebellion, right? If we're openly and willfully grieving the Holy Spirit, backsliding our faith, I don't think we can say that God necessarily is going to use us in that moment. But if we're walking with God and we trip and fall, we mess up, we have hope from these stories, that God can still use us and does use us, and that he protects us from ourselves from making a mess of our life too much. We'll still have to face the consequences like Lot did. We still have to face the consequences like Abraham did, right? He didn't have his wife for a while. But God eventually will bring us back to where we need to be because he's faithful. Again, think about the men and women that we've seen in Genesis so far. Adam's sin caused the world to fall. Eve sinned, right? Gave the fruit to Adam. She helped cause the world to fall. Noah was righteous for certain. But what happened after the world was flooded and he was given the covenant of the rainbow that God would never again destroy the whole earth with a flood? He got drunk and took his clothes off. Abraham is this pillar of faith, the father of faith, the father of many nations. He's this great, great man that we all look up to, and yet he sinned twice by saying Sarah was his half-sister, was his sister. And Sarah herself, the great matriarch, she sinned when she laughed after God said she would give birth in a year. And Lot was just a hot mess, wasn't he? Yet God gave them grace. Many of them are in the hall of faith, Hebrews chapter 11. And he still chose to use them. Even though they were rascals, he still chose to use them. And he still chooses to use you. I know you guys have skeletons in your closet. We all do. God still uses you. He's not asking you to fix up your life first and then he can use you. He'll fix up your life and then he'll use you. We see this, how Christ is the pinnacle of this. Romans 5:6-8 says that Christ died for the ungodly, right? That when we were yet sinners, when we were at our worst, when we were dead in sin, steeped in sin, unable to save ourselves, that's when Christ saved us, fixed us up, so to speak, and uses us. So my friends, as we close here, the Bible is chock full of imperfect, messy people being used by God to fulfill his perfect will. And as I look at this room, I see God using, I don't mean this is an insult, but bear with me here, imperfect, messy people to fulfill his perfect will in your life and in his purpose, his will in your life and his purpose for your life. So if you feel inadequate, if you feel weak, if you feel helpless, if you feel less than, if you feel like Paul did in Romans 7, I know the right thing to do and I can't seem to do it. I just can't get over this sin. I try and I try and I try. I can't get out of this sin. You're in great company because that's every single godly person in the Bible. And he will use you just like he used them. He will be faithful to you just like he was faithful to them. And he will take you into his arms and say, well done, my good and faithful servant, just like he did them, if you don't give up and if you believe. Do you believe that? Let me pray. God, you are so good to us. Lord, I always think about it like this. If I was in your shoes, I would have given up on me a long time ago. I'm not worth it. How many times can I sin the same sin over and over and over again? I'm not worth it. I would give up on me. You never give up on me. And you never give up on a single person in this room because you are a faithful, awesome, gracious, and forgiving God. And Lord, even when we stumble and we fall, and we do, and we will, you don't ever stop being faithful. You don't ever stop being gracious. You don't ever stop being loving to us. This is the hope that we have in you. It's a hope that does not disappoint. That you love us and use us, not just at our best, but at our worst. Oh, you are such an awesome God. We love you. Amen.
Please stand. One, two, three, four, five, six.
All of the earth makes straight a highway, a path for the Lord. Jesus is coming soon. Call back the sinner, wake up the saint. Let every nation shout of your fame. Jesus is coming soon. Like a bride waiting for the groom, we'll be a church ready for you. Every heart longing for our King, we sing, even so come, Lord Jesus, come. Even so come, Lord Jesus, come. There will be justice, all will be new. Your name forever, faithful and true. Jesus is coming soon. Like a bride waiting for the groom, we'll be a church ready for you. Every heart longing for our King, we sing, even so come, Lord Jesus, come. Even so come, Lord Jesus, come. So we wait for you. God, we wait, you're coming soon. So we wait for you. God, we wait, you're coming soon. Like a bride waiting for her groom, we'll be a church ready for you. Every heart longing for our King, we'll sing. Like a bride waiting for her groom, we'll be a church ready for you. Every heart longing for our King, we'll sing. Even so come, Lord Jesus, come. Even so come, Lord Jesus, human soul, come, Lord Jesus, come.
You know what I love about the Lord? He is good to us even when we don't deserve it, because he's always good. This is the God that we serve. I want to let you know that after this service, we're going to have prayer for healing. This is based upon James chapter 5. So if any of you are sick and need prayer for healing, would you come forward? The elders would love to pray for you, trusting that God will help make you well, if that's in his will. If you'd like prayer for any other reasons, please come forward. We'd love to pray for you. I want to share with you a benediction. This is Galatians 5:14. I just pray that this would seep into your hearts as you leave today. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law is one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Would you just go today making that your commitment? I want to love my neighbor as myself. Remember what Jesus said, who's my neighbor? One man asked Jesus, and he told the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Everybody's your neighbor. Everybody. Even people you don't like. Let's love them as we love ourselves. I love you all. I appreciate you all. Go with God. God loves you, and he's good to you no matter what, and he will use you even when you're being imperfect. Bless you.